MusicalTalk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of MusicalTalk. I'm Thos, and whilst there is a very good company taking place in London at the moment, no one's ever accused me of being that. Oh well. Well, as you will undoubtedly be aware, the world is marking the centenary of the Armistice, the ending of hostilities at the conclusion of the First World War, the famous 11th hour of the 11th day in 1918. And of course many countries have marked that annually ever since, as Armistice Day or Remembrance Day. But the centenary of Armistice Day also brings to an end the commemorations which have taken place over the last 4 years of the First World War, that appalling global conflict. But as we've had cause to remark here on Musical Talk before, for some reason the First World War had an amazing legacy in terms of popular culture, not least theatre, and as part of that, musical theatre. If you think of the First World War in musical terms, you're most likely to come up with all those World War songs that became music hall standards. Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag, Goodbye, Goodbye Dolly Gray, and It's a Long Way to Tipperary. Indeed, the First World War was, if you like, the last high point of the music hall culture in Britain. It very swiftly went into decay in the 1920s, when it fell foul to its principal rivals, film and radio, and before it morphed into variety, and then crept back into favour via television. And if you think that's not still true, may I just point you in the direction of The X Factor. But we also remember some of the musicals that came out from the First World War. Not widely seen, but fairly widely known, Chu Chin Chow, a version of the Aladdin story. And of course, then there are songs which came out of the war in their own right. And of course, the primary one of these is Keep the Home Fires Burning, discussed here on Musical Talk on a number of occasions. But the irony of ironies is that the best known First World War musical, of course, isn't really from the First World War. It has songs from the First World War, and it's about the First World War. It first came into being very nearly on the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. But it isn't in itself a show from that period. I am, of course, talking about Oh, What a Lovely War, and that's the subject of today's programme. Now, Oh, What a Lovely War is a show that we've discussed on a myriad of occasions here previously on Musical Talk. And so what I've done is I've culled sections from various episodes where we've discussed it in the past, drawing particularly heavily from 2 episodes which we broadcast in 2014. That's episodes 428 and 429, where we analysed the show and reviewed the then current 50th anniversary revival of Oh What a Lovely War at the Theatre Royal Stratford, where it was first originated by Joan Littlewood. So, what you're going to hear today is a series of extracts. You'll first hear a conversation I had with Tim Saywood about that 2013/14 production of Oh What a Lovely War, which was just going on national tour. And then after that, you'll hear a conversation between me, David Herzog and Nick Hudson on why Oh What a Lovely War is a household name still in Britain, but is generally unheard of in America. There'll then be another conversation with Tim, a short one this time, which leads up to an extract of his conversation with Philip Headley, the co-executor of the estate of Joan Littlewood, as he talks about the creation of Oh What a Lovely War in 1963. It's a genuinely fascinating insight from someone who was there. Quite remarkable. And that comes from episode 26 of Musical Talk, still available in the Musical Talk archives. And then just to conclude the episode, there'll be an extract from me, recorded in 2014, commenting on the continuing legacy, and indeed controversy, relating to Oh What a Lovely War, as we remember a media debate by the then Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove, and Philip Headley, which was conducted in the national newspapers at the time, and shows the power of the show even today. So that's a lot to be getting through, which makes this a bumper episode. So I hope you'll enjoy this collation from the Musical Talk archive from our various and many discussions on Oh, What a Lovely War. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Tim!
Hello.
Lovely to see you. Can I ask...
You're incorrect, I'm afraid, on that point.
Is it not correct? Is it not lovely to see you?
No, it never is.
Did you have a lovely war?
Yes, I did. It was beautiful, thank you. Yes, we went and saw it, didn't we?
We went to see Oh, What a Lovely War,
To put it in other terms.
Yes, the 50th anniversary revival, which started a year or so ago to great success when it was revived, and a lot of people saying, well, why hasn't this come to the West End?
Yep.
But what it has done, it's come back to the Theatre Royal Stratford in London East,
Yep.
where it started originally in 63, and we saw it on its last night there before it's gone off on national tours.
Well, it's a thing of national significance. I mean,
It is.
we are currently sort of marking, I suppose, the 100th anniversary of the war, and have been
The First World War.
The First World War, exactly, and have been now for a couple of years. So, or at least 2. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's what I count as a couple.
Okay, great.
My calculations match yours.
But I'd never seen it, I have to say, and it's done quite a lot. It certainly was when I was at school, and we thought of doing production, and I saw the film directed by Richard Attenborough, which is a very starry thing that followed a few years after the Joan Littlewood production, and featured the absolute cream of the acting profession of the time, and several Redgraves were in it, and
John Mills
was in it, John Gielgud was in it, Olivier I think was in it as well, wasn't he? And basically it was sort of every theatrical night going, basically.
Yeah.
Maggie Smith was in it, of course, did a great number that we'll talk about in a little while. But it's actually a very different beast on the stage than it is in the film. The film sort of scales it up and makes it a sort of almost Gandhi style, like,
a blockbuster.
Yeah, a thing that explores the war, but at scale. Whereas the great thing about the original musical is that it uses the songs of the time, but it feels like a theatre piece. It's very it uses the conventions of the Pierrot show, the end of the Pierrot show. So it's told by lots of different clowns.
Just so people understand, the Pierrot show, long dead tradition in this country, is sort of part of the wider variety firmament. Sort of its heyday, I think, would have to be really sort of 1900 to about 1930 if you were pushing it.
Right, okay.
And sometimes also known as the concert party tradition.
Yes.
But as
in which the clowns all wear this. If you think of the David Bowie style Ashes to Ashes type clown with the sort of pointy hat and the sort of ruffled sleeves and stuff.
Yes, it's sort of black and white,
that
sort of frilly thing. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just say, by the way, my way into Oh, What a Lovely War is the complete reverse. I've never seen the film, but I did see a very excellent version in Edinburgh a few years ago.
Right.
And so I was aware of the piece as a theatrical concept.
Right.
And a concept, I think, is the word for Oh, What a Lovely War. I think it is a proper concept musical.
Well, they credit Charles Chilton as the person who had the idea, and
BBC radio producer.
Joan Littlewood was the director.
That's right, because it famously, as I think a lot of people know, started off as a radio sort of dramatisation and documentary of the First World War, interspersed using the music of the war, almost to make a sarcastic point. Certainly it was all on the vanguard of revisionism of the First World War.
Yeah.
And so this is very much, if you like, and you said landmark at the beginning, it's very much almost the first step to that revisionist position on the First World War that most people currently have.
It popularised it, certainly,
yes.
And it was kind of quite important in popularising it.
Which is, wasn't it a big waste?
Yes, exactly.
For very little purpose.
Yeah.
Now, that's a debate that still happens. I mean, this isn't a place for a discussion on the debate, but
I don't think either of us are that well qualified either, maybe. Well, I suppose we...
No, but what I mean is only last year, in 2014, which was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, certainly in Europe,
yes,
the then Secretary of State for Education questioned whether the revisionist position was absolutely correct in all its attitudes.
That's right, yes.
Whatever one's position on that debate and discussion that he raised, what it shows is it's still relevant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what were you expecting? I suppose this is my question, because we've touched on Oh, What a Lovely War here, and you said landmark, and it's one of those shows which people talk about, is still spoken about and is a genuine example of theatre changing attitudes or helping to solidify attitudes. In a sense, what did you expect to see?
Well, I think one of the key things I was probably expecting was possibly to be disappointed, because this is a very legendary production, and in fact, if you go back quite a few episodes in the sequence of Musical Talk, I interviewed Philip Headley about it, and he gave me a lot of information about, a lot of additional information about how they did things like, for example, the Bells of Hell, which happens towards the end of the thing, and a couple of anecdotes about that. But I wasn't disappointed. I thought it was actually it held together very well. And while its political message is not subtle, the war wasn't particularly subtle either from that point of view. So
I think it's exactly the right approach for what it's tackling,
yeah,
and indeed attacking.
And I think it paints a very good. I mean, again, not having seen the original production, I don't know to what extent that they did. How closely observed this was to that, obviously starting with those particular clown costumes and the change of scene and so on. I don't know exactly how that was done. But they begin with this big concept of it's a war game, don't they? So effectively it's as if it's a roll up type of music hall attraction, and they quickly and rather deftly summarise the sort of great power politics for those who weren't sort of following that at the time, or weren't around at the time. And so that's quite good. And then immediately we switch focus down and for pretty much the rest of the piece, down to the experience of like the everyday soldiers, basically, wherever they were from, whether it was from Ireland or Australia or whether it was from, Scotland, England, wherever. They focus a great deal on that. And there are some very gruelling scenes where people go through, hell basically in the trenches and as part of the trench warfare. That are very moving, and I think it does that very successfully.
I think we should say here, we went with some other friends who had only the knowledge of the piece as it is popularly understood in the public conception, and didn't quite know what to make of it when they came out. Now, I can understand that, and indeed one of them said to me, I think it would have been better, he said, if there had been a kind of continuous set of characters that we could get to feel and see what happened to.
Yeah.
Now, I simply don't agree with that, because I think that's the trap that most Second World War musicals
it is a sort of a review,
into. Yes.
Interestingly, they do attempt that in the film a little bit. There is an initial family who show up, and one of them signs up to go away to war, and they follow him quite a way through, actually. I think it's one of the Redgraves, actually, that does that. So so obviously Richard Attenborough felt the same.
Well, I can understand it, but I don't think this is an example where the macro being drawn from the micro, which is essentially what that concept does, helps. I actually think the bluntness. I think the show is very blunt, and I think it just shows you things and lets you gasp at it.
Yes,
because it's unadulterated.
Besides which, your contact characters anyway are that the actors at the beginning are the actors. They're not playing a part, and they introduce themselves to you as actors, and
that's right.
And in a sense, you're following them through the thing, really. So I don't think it is a weakness. There are some very famous numbers in there. We Don't Want to Lose You, I think, is a particularly famous one. And indeed, in particular, the recruitment number, I'll make a man of you, to make a man of any one of you. On Saturday, I'm willing, if you'll only take the shilling, to make a man of any one of you. Which is a really strong illustration of the cynicism of the sort of recruitment effort, effectively.
Yes.
And that it pulls, as they do all the way through, the sharp contrast between the sort of sentiment and the even nobility of the sentiment of the songs expressed in the music hall songs, and the horrible reality that they were pulling people towards.
Well, I think you make a good point there, perhaps quite loosely, but actually, although the show is a concept musical, if it does anything, it sort of follows the thread of the reality and also the public perception and the misperception of the public over the 4-year period of the war, 1914 to 1918. So the earlier stuff, I mean, if we just read through the song list...
It's very hopeful, yes. So we start with Alexander's Ragtime Band,
which is a very upbeat
1904 hit, I think. And
has the lyrics...
it's Irving Berlin, isn't it?
It's Irving Berlin's song, and it's his first big hit, actually. First big international proper hit, but it's... I can't remember how the lyric works, but it's something like, it's so natural that you want to go to war.
Yes.
Actually, which sometimes is now rewritten to be slightly less stridently
martial,
militaristic.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So that's a song that talks about, shall we say, you said the war game, they use the word the war game.
That's
that
right.
was the popular conception at the beginning for an awful lot of young men in particular, that war was a bit of a game.
Yeah.
Britain had been unusually at peace for about 10-15 years, which it often didn't do.
Well,
so there was a whole generation of people who hadn't realised what the horror of war was.
Well, these other songs, We Don't Want to Lose You, but We Think You Should Go, it's by the Ladies, is another example of that sort of music hall song that attempts to deploy guilt. Belgium put the kibosh on the Kaiser, was a very big hit at the time, I believe, and
yes,
it was drawn from the war period.
Because basically I don't know if you know your military history, but the Schlieffen Plan,
Yes.
which had been revised by von Moltke, required.
I hope you're listening, listeners.
required
It'll be a
Germany
test at the end.
to march through the neutral countries in order to encircle Paris and France.
That's right. Yeah.
But although Belgium completely capitulated, it didn't do so as quickly as the Germans had expected.
Yes.
Hence the
And
very.
Europe took a stick and made him sore, and then as you hold your hand out, naughty boy, and he will never sit upon them anymore. Something like that. I can't
It
remember.
was something like that, and you're quite right to remember, incidentally, the "Hold Your Hand Out, Naughty Boy," which of course is actually a reference to another popular musical song called
Hold Your Hand Out, Naughty
You Naughty
Boy.
Boy.
That's right.
Yes, absolutely. So it's very much in the music hall tradition.
Yeah.
But as the show develops, you move through 14 to 15, from 15 to 16, all the way through to 18, and the horror starts to swamp. So all this kind of sort of gung-ho nationalism, this kind of go on men, you're all cowards unless you go out there kind of stuff.
Yeah.
As you say, the recruitment through guilt, that starts to, I mean, those tools are still in place, of course, because the governments of the day had nothing else to go.
No.
But the reality was it started to become swamped by the reality of the story, the stories that were coming through, and the experiences. And you see that, I think, in the songs as they become more and more cynical and more about loss.
Yes.
And more and more
Goodbye
about...
is how you finished, at least in the original production, that's how you finished the first half.
Okay, it's a very good song to finish off an act, isn't it?
Well,
Goodbye. Please come back in 15 minutes. That's
I
not how the
suppose so,
second verse
yeah.
goes, of course.
And I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, which I think takes you to sort of one of the most bleak parts, which I think is sung to the tune of What a Friend We Have in Jesus, which was a very popular hymn of the time.
Which tells its own satirical bite.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, of course,
And When This Lousy War Is Over, which is also to the same tune, and it takes it as a yet further sort of level of cynicism. And of course, The Bells of Hell go ting-a-ling-a-ling for you and not for me.
Yeah, a lovely song. I find the title song, "Oh What a Lovely War," to be a fantastically cynical song. I don't know if you know the tune, but it goes something along the lines of "Oh, what a lovely war." So it's got quite good melodic catch. Yes, and it's got lovely lines in what do we need with eggs and ham when we've got plum and apple jam?
Yes,
So
that's right.
we've got really awful food, so don't
Yeah.
and how can we ever spend the pay? That's another one.
Yes.
Who wouldn't be a soldier? It's almost a shame to take the pay, I think it is
That's
how the
right,
actual
yes,
lyric goes.
yeah.
So they're cynical, and when you sing them outside of a wartime environment, you still get the cynicism. But when you put this in the show, within the environment of trenches and death and people dying, actually that cynicism takes on a much darker hue, I think, actually.
Well, yeah.
It's not light cynicism, it's heavy cynicism.
I mean, that's the thing, and it goes, and I mean, it's that all the way through. It just isn't really, I mean, it has that one trick is perhaps
a conceit.
Yeah, it's right, the concept, if you like. And it just does that over and over and over and over again until you get the message, basically. So in that sense, it's not subtle, but it's I think they managed to, considering that is the technique all the way through, they do manage to find lots of different scenarios from the war to present to you. Some a little bit sentimental, some, very nasty. I mean, I think the one that I remember is there's a succession of, I think they're Irish soldiers that they get shot one by one, basically, and
Yes.
they're portrayed as being in a trench somewhere in no man's land, sort of, and they've come under shelling. They're starting to be shelled by their own side because of the confusion of the battle, and one by one in fact, there's a Monty Python sketch in The Meaning of Life that sort of slightly replicates the structure of it. They go off to try and find someone to get help or to, whatever, for whatever purpose, and one by one we hear the shots ring out, that spell the end for each individual one of them as they go. And that's a very compelling scene, and very very moving, really.
There are some real people represented in the piece overall. Some briefly, some significantly. Brief examples are the King and the Queen are very briefly represented. This is the British King and Queen. I suppose
Yes.
there were a lot around at the time
Yes,
to pick
yes.
from. The British King and Queen are briefly featured near the beginning.
Yes.
And you also get Sir John French, who at the time was the principal soldier in charge of the British Armed Forces on the ground.
That's right.
Who was there, I think, until 1916. And who was famously arrogant and famously didn't bring an interpreter to meet.
That's right.
And that scene is actually portrayed where he meets other generals from other
From
Allied
the
armies.
French army, yeah, specifically.
And cannot speak with them.
And with Belgium.
And and that goes as well as you would expect. And then you see a scene in the middle where you see the office politics, shall we say,
yes.
of the British Army, where who's conniving with who in order to get French deposed.
Yes.
And then finally you see Haig, who history has not
triumph.
treated kindly, and I think with good reason. But Haig has one idea. Haig was seen as the man to replace French, although it turns out that he never actually passed his army exams.
Oh, right.
He had a position, at least this is alleged in the piece, I think, that he has a position because he has the friends in the right places. But he has one idea, which is to demoralise the German troops by continually having offences against them.
Yep.
But of course, you and I know, and it's a famous dictum, that if you do the same thing over and over again, you cannot expect a different result. And what happens is you have all the over-the-top attacks, and huge numbers die.
Yeah.
And then he just says, well, the next one will be the
final
one that
push.
finally does it. But there's an awful lot of final pushes.
Yes.
He's a
more
man
heave.
and he's only got the one idea, and he's shown really to be intellectually utterly bankrupt as well as morally so.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, they got themselves into a terrible situation in the sense of there was a stalemate, wasn't there, for years and years, and
Yes.
and millions of people died, and the amount of land gained was pitiful, really, in most cases.
Which brings us on to one of the other concepts that you see on the stage. It's now a neon sign. It probably wasn't a sort of a dot matrix sign. It probably wasn't in 1963. But basically, at the back there
I'm
is
guessing it was slides, but yeah.
But there's a notice board essentially, an electronic notice board, and after each, shall we say, sketch, it makes it sound a lot lighter than it is, but it is a series of sketches and dramatisations. After each chapter or episode, shall we say,
you get some stats.
Yeah, you get statistics, and it will say April 1916 offensive of the Somme, or whichever it is, and then it will say battle last 16 days, and then some truly staggering numbers: 750,000 people, 1 million people, 1.5 million people die. Amount of land gained: 20 yards, 50 yards, sometimes no yards at all. And funnily enough, I thought that, when it came to pure brutality and bluntness, that was the thing, in fact, that rammed it home. The show itself was a series of incidentals and lots of separate sentences, from which you could combine to make a narrative of the war.
Yep.
But the full stops at the end of each sentence were 5 times bigger than they would be if you were printing them, if that makes sense.
Yes,
so
yeah.
what it did, it highlighted it. This is very. I was about to say it highlights its own punctuation, and I don't want it to sound like I'm trivialising it, but actually it was if you like, the editorial on what you've just seen.
That's right.
Was just purely statistics, so it wasn't in any way.
It's also
meant to mean anything other than what it did. It just said what it was, and that was staggering.
One thing that's interesting about this is that the original show coincided with basically the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the war,
more or less,
give or take a month or two, and of course this now is the 100th. So we literally, but the same show is being presented in much the same way, and we've seen other shows and things about the First World War of late. War Horse being obviously the most notable, which is a very different kind of story, although I don't think its underlying narrative of how the war progressed is much different. For those who haven't seen it, which can't be many people now.
Oh, it's very much a post "Oh, What a Lovely War" show.
Yes,
in
that's
the sense
right.
of it draws.
Well,
from
it's
the
very
same narrative.
theatrical, and it uses, it's very sparing in its stagecraft, and it doesn't.
And it's not an apology for the war in any way.
No way at all. So, so the closest we've had probably is Downton, isn't it? And I'm not sure even
on television.
Yeah, exactly. We haven't had. And occasionally they revive, which again is of a similar sort of flavour. Journey's End by R.C. Sheriff.
Yes.
Has been back to the West End, I think, in recent years.
Indeed, and Birdsong.
And Birdsong, called Sebastian Faulks. Yeah. So
both of which I saw in the last 5 years in the West End and on national tour.
Yeah.
Both tremendously striking. Journey's End is the nearest thing to a contemporary play. Of course, it was only written in 1920, 26, I think. But
so in that sense, it was the first of a wave of.
It absolutely was the first.
Following the poets.
Yes, because for the first 10 years, no one could talk about the war. Really, it was just so
traumatic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to ask you a question from the historic point of view. Well, here we are. We're in the 21st century. We're watching, if you like, the 100th anniversary of the war in this musical, the 50th anniversary of the show itself. When it was coming on in 1963, veterans from the war, and indeed people from that era, were all alive. Not all of them, but a large number of them were still alive.
Yes.
So it was very much in living memory. Here we are, after 100 years, it is no longer in living
There's
memory.
only
The last British
years.
veteran is all gone.
Yes.
what we have, however, is in 1963 you could take those songs and most people would know them.
Yes.
Or most of them.
So now it's more of a museum piece.
Yes, it's a museum piece because most of those songs are now not. There
That's
is no
right.
popular currency.
In fact, the chances of you knowing those songs, unless you'd seen the show, and of course I only know most of the songs from having seen the film in the first place, that's really the only sense of familiarity you get. And of course I think that does reduce the pathos of the thing. Because if you had a grandfather, if you were 50 years ago, or even a little bit less, and had a grandfather who sang those songs, or the Pack Up the Troubles, that would have had a significance that it won't have now.
Well, that's my question. Do you think it would have packed a stronger punch in 1963 than now? Because
yes, I do, unquestionably, because I think it would have been. I think a lot of the people who were involved. I mean, don't forget also, the Second World War was much fresher in people's minds. As an adult, you could have seen it in 1963, and the chances are you'd have some memories of the Second World War, and you'd have a little bit of an idea. Particularly if you were living in Stratford, and that's where they drew their audience from, and particularly if you'd lived long enough to remember the Blitz, you'd have a very, I think, real idea about what some of these scenes are. It's quite possible for people like us who've never really had that level of discomfort to deal with. Discomfort seems a slightly trivial way of putting it, but trauma.
We'd not be
and
faced with life and death in a way that anyone else.
Not at all at that in that way. So I think yes, it would have packed much more of a punch in those days, and I think it would have really had a very visceral reaction from people. Nowadays, it's a sort of. It's almost a little bit comforting because if you're a liberal, who sort of subscribes to what is now, as you say, the generally accepted interpretation of the war, it's not challenging in any way. It doesn't frighten you. In 1963, we'd gone off the tail end of Empire certainly, but there was still a good deal of jingoism and a good deal of the idea of poking fun at the Royals and suggesting they were all just sort of a political class out for themselves and stuff like that was I think even then a little bit more radical than it is now.
Oh, now that's interesting because I didn't read this as an anti-royalist piece.
No. Well, neither did I. But it's certainly heavily emphasises the distinction between the people like the Haigs and the Frenches and the people at the top of the tree,
the privileged classes, should we say?
And their lack of engagement with the suffering of the working class people who were going to the war. I mean,
I now can't remember if this joke was in the piece or not. But do you know the joke about the soldier who's on in the trench in the First World War and decides to desert? So he runs away from the trenches and he runs day and night for 4 days and 4 nights, and he eventually comes to rest in this village. And a man walks up to him in British officer uniform, and the man says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm deserting, sir." And he says, "Don't you know who I am? I'm a general of the British Army." And he says, "Blimey, have I run that far?" I can't remember if that joke was included or not.
No, I think it might have been actually, yes.
But it very much sums up the who was safe and who wasn't idea.
Well, I think also you'll notice that there are very few attempts to portray the people in the middle, actually, because there would have been a lot of people in the middle. There were people right at the front line in appalling circumstances. Literally, there's one scene, isn't there, in which a nurse describes not being able, people who are literally dying in front of her eyes, who cannot get treatment because they, despite the fact that they're dying in front of her eyes, are not as high a priority as some other poor bugger, basically. And there's literally no beds, and people are on crates, and on it's horrifying. And then the contrast is obviously very clearly drawn between the ballroom, in which the office politics that you described happens for the senior ranks of the army, and we don't see much of the people in between. We don't see the sort of bureaucrats and the the middle classes and the shopkeepers and the home front and stuff like that. We see little of that, which in a way sort of helps to
polarise.
Yes, to keep the picture very stark and to sort of keep the contrast very stark. Having said that, of course, the people on the front line, we are talking of millions and millions of people, so it's not as if there's a shortage of stories to tell.
And an awful lot of, it has to be said, upper class sons were officers in the trenches who died as well, so it's not as simple as that, is it? Can we go back to the score, though? Now, you said quite, and I agree with you. I think for people who knew the songs will have a greater resonance, particularly as the songs were being used in the way that they may or may not have been intended, or at least were understood to have been intended in popular culture in the 60s.
Yep.
However, now, for all intents and purposes, these songs are not known. So it is, in fact, actually a new score. Although it isn't, of course. It's actually a jukebox musical in one level.
Yes,
because
it is,
they're all plucked.
And was at the time, yeah.
Yes. It is, because the songs are no longer known. Now, you said you think it would have had a stronger impact. Did you think the fact that you didn't know the songs for the most part robbed it of any impact for you? Or was the piece still impactvel?
No, I think it's...
And did the music aid that, I suppose?
Well, the thing is, I did know the songs from having seen the film, but... well, I don't know really what to say, but other than... I'm sure it would have had greater impact. If there were songs that we know from our childhoods that mean something when they appear in a TV drama, and that's inevitably always going to be the
But
case.
that's not quite what I was asking. I was the fact that you don't have huge knowledge, or one might. Were the songs necessary, or could it have worked without the songs?
No, it couldn't have worked without the songs because
so what did they bring even to a modern audience?
Well, because they are the principal means of ironising the whole thing. So I mean, I think it's like in cabaret, or like in a lot of those sort of hard-bitten musicals where the songs are as a convention are used to sort of throw into relief, like Dancer in the Dark and things like that. Where the songs are used in such a way. I'm trying to think of other examples. Chicago, there's lots of ironic songs, and that's sort of what Candle Ebb do, as we'll probably talk about another time.
But those are newly written songs.
Yes, but in a sense,
the irony is still there.
But given that they, in Candle Ebb, for example, the songs are frequently based on specific tunes of the time. Yeah. That the music is set
styles,
in. Yes. In fact, does give you the same feel.
It subverts a well-known model, and that's what's going on here, I think.
It's also probably worth saying that, of course, some of the songs that we're getting are themselves satires on other songs.
Yes.
So Hush, Here Comes a Whiz Bang is based on a song called Hush, Here Comes a Dream Man, for example, which was so a lot of what we get in the second act, particularly, are ones, and the Sergeant Seals Your Rum, and they were only playing Leapfrog. That's actually is that the Battle Hymn of the Republic? I think. Yeah, I think it is. So those ones are, already you call it folk music, or they're subversions of existing songs.
Well, I think once again this shows that move from the British public to the British soldiers. So in the first act, as I said, we move from the public trying to get the soldiers out there, and all those songs were written for the music hall. They aren't soldier songs; they're songs about soldiers.
Yes.
Or to encourage people to become soldiers. As it moves on, the songs become more and more from the trenches themselves.
Yes, that's
and
right.
They're going to be a much bitterer.
Except, interestingly, at the very end, when they switch to the Ivor Novello, "Keep the Home Fires Burning," which was a song written at the time. I think
it's actually right from the beginning. It's actually from 1914.
Which, of course, isn't ironised, and in fact seems to it's
a song of poignancy,
which tends to disguise the sort of horror of war, doesn't it, a little bit?
It's sentimental, and that's Novello all over.
I think it's placed there for the older generation who would have seen the show originally.
And well, I can tell you, even to this day, you have to have a select audience, but I was in a show in Edinburgh in summer of 2014, and "Keep the Home Fires Burning" was sung beautifully. And the older people in the audience sang along with it. That is a song that still has, for a certain generation, certainly not the generation of the war.
Well, it's a sort of we'll meet again of the First World War, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Yeah. And I tell you the other thing, and I've discussed this in previous episodes of Musical Talk as well. Unlike all the other sort of anthemic songs of the First World War, and that is what it is not a national anthemic song.
No.
It's actually about the individual and the personal, and not about the state and the battle. It is about separation and loss, and not really about fighting.
No, that's right.
Which is why I think it's actually survived. It survived the transition of '63, which is, if you like, the teetering point when the pre-revisionist and revisionist occurred. You
see that transition also in things like John Osborne's The Entertainer, which date from a similar period, where the music hall culture, and of course it is the one of the characters is an old music hall star, represents basically the end of empire and the end of that perspective.
Yeah.
That was, that people internalised if they were from the First World War generation in order to try and get them through the bloody thing.
And that was Laurence Olivier again in the film.
It was
version.
Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The point I was going to make actually about the score also is it's actually quite cleverly paced. It's used, I think, to help the audience acclimatise to the horror of it all. Certainly in Act 2, we see more and more of the neon signs as the years progress. The numbers become staggering. I mean, as we speak about it, it's almost impossible to get the power across, but when you're seeing people on the stage and then it says 1.5 million people died, that's the highest
Verdun,
number.
I think, or Somme, I can't remember, something like that, yeah.
There were several,
I think it was Verdun.
It was shocking, and that was the stuff that sort of pulled that gave you the punch in the stomach.
Yeah.
But actually, what they then did, of course, is they used the songs to just occasionally, throw you a straw to cling on to.
Yeah.
So there'd be there's actually a sing-along in the second act, which is Sister Susie's sewing shirts for sailors, or socks as I know it, but it's shirts here, and it was on the night. There's also a couple of others which are a little lighter or a little pacier, and what you do, you've just seen something truly gruesome or truly awful. You've been shocked to the core, and then they give you a little bit of a respite by giving you a song that just feels a bit bouncier or funnier, or maybe not that funny, just not shockingly awful.
Yeah.
And you grasp at it, and then sometimes they would pull the rug away from you under the.
I was going to say, there's a lot of rug pulling really going on. I think you sort of enjoy yourself for a few minutes, and then
they throw you a life raft, and then discover it's got a hole in it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, it's a very, as I say, it still does that successfully today.
So, Sister Susie Sewing Shirts for Sailors was a sing-along.
Soldiers?
For soldiers, you're quite right. I'm so sorry if I got the armed forces wrong. I think airmen could be ruled out, as they famously go shirtless, apparently.
Yes.
Here's the point. Actually, it's the only song that you were asked to do that musical tradition of singing along with.
Yes,
now,
that's true.
partly, is that to remind you that this is still pretending to be a concert party? Because by this stage you're so immersed in the horror of the war that actually you sometimes need to be reminded that there's a framework.
Yes, I think it's also to just lift the audience a little bit towards the end. I think it sort of has a structural function really, which is
so people don't commit suicide in the car park.
Well, maybe just to sort of bring people up, and it's sort of in the position in what would be a sort of conventional Broadway musical of what they call the 11 o'clock number.
I actually think it's rather closer to a pantomime in that sense. In fact, it's the number towards when you've pretty much wrapped everything up very nearly. You're waiting for the walk down, but you get the front of curtain stuff where they actually sing.
Well, we don't know where that originated. Maybe it did originate in other forms, because I mean...
well, Victorian pantomime adopted a lot of things from other places, so yes, absolutely. But can I ask, what they do is, the conceit, however, is they get the audience to sing along once it's been sung along with on stage once or twice.
Yeah.
But then it gets faster and faster and faster and faster.
Right.
What is the symbolism of that? Is it just but towards the end of the war, everything was just being done over and over and over and over again until something broke, which is essentially what actually did happen.
Of the machine, as it were, sort of, the war machine had gone mad, sort of thing. Is the feeling, I suppose, and that that everybody couldn't keep up and became victims of the thing. I don't know really. I mean, it sort of feels like it belongs in there. It doesn't feel like a jarring sort of sudden attempt to just jolly everyone along. I mean, it absolutely feels like it belongs to the show, and I think one of the things is that there's a great deal in there about the meaningfulness and meaninglessness of the recruitment narrative. So that, just these words that get mouthed about sort of one more push and pulling through and, all of that sort of stuff. One for what they used to say in those days, but... putting a face on it, and those sorts of
lip. Yeah, that's right.
Schoolboy expressions of the era. Those through meaningless repetition eventually come to seem empty and stupid, and I think that's kind of what it does.
And yet, forgive me, I just want to contrast that against. There is a scene, I think it's in the second act, where we see sort of a liberal woman giving a speech from a balcony, arguing that the war is futile and that people were being sent to their deaths. Right. And in fact, it has the reverse effect on the civilian population who are being portrayed listening to it. They see it as sort of anti-national.
That's right, yes. They think she's attacking the sort of, she's basically saying that we should lose the war, sort of thing, And
so they turn against her.
Well, I think that's there for a very good reason. I think the reason is that, people watching the show who don't know why the war happened might very well be thinking to themselves, well, why didn't they do what they did in Russia and revolt against the government and get rid of them? And it sort of shows you just in a little miniature there, like what the problem was with people trying to sort of get some traction for showing people that they were being oppressed.
Also, I mean...
It was very, very politically illustrative, actually, isn't it? Because, I mean, you see it all the time. You see it today. I mean, that's like we see today as much as people don't want to be told that they're being exploited. They want to be told that they have a chance.
Yeah. I mean, it's a way of playing people, isn't it? I thought it was quite interesting because in the earlier act, the first act, as is known, there is this scene, actually, where, as you say, they're trying to recruit and I'll make a man out of you. White feathers are passed to people in the audience, which actually occurred in the First World War. Yes. This is something I only knew recently. It's not actually featured in the musical that we saw. But this, I think, it underlies the point you've just made about how why people didn't back it up. Historically, suffragettes are seen very much on the liberal side as being progressive. Yeah. Absolutely, of course, votes for women. I think that's fairly self-evident. That's not a battle anyone needs to discuss today. But they were seen as radical at the time, And despite their radicalism, I hadn't realised this, but the suffragette movement was one of the principal movements, one of the principal movers behind the white feather movement, which makes it, forgive me from my modern perspective, you expect the good people to be good and the bad people to be bad, but they're not, because everyone's a bit good and everyone's a bit bad. And that is only something I realised recently, and I was shocked by that.
I tell you where a lot of the resonance of this show comes from now, actually, for those who don't have those personal memories, i.e. nearly all of us. Is of course we're currently undergoing this business of austerity.
Yes.
And I think you sort of hit upon it by saying that people reject that sort of narrative. So it sort of does have quite a strong parallel here in the sense that we're being told, well, one more push, a little bit more saving, a little bit more
one more term to finish the job,
belt tightening, and a little bit more, desperate saving, and we'll cut a little bit of this and we'll cut a little bit of that, and somehow we'll get through this and we'll pay down our debts. It is very much the exact rhetoric of the First World War, the establishment in the First World War, and I think the show encourages you to look at it in the same way. And there are people arguing against it, saying it doesn't have to be this way, and why do we have to sort of throw, in this case, masses of millions of billions of pounds into it as opposed to billions of lives, but a lot of people on the ground say no, actually this is don't you dare talk the country down, and we should just be taking benefits away, or disability benefits, or reducing immigration, or whatever it is. So I think maybe
the debate is still being had on the same terms.
So I think maybe in that sense it's sort of lucky that the 50th anniversary of the show has come around at this time, because there is a sort of a parallel. And of course, if you imagine what Joan Littlewood would be doing now, if she was running,
it would be exactly about
the Theatre Royal Stratford East, it would be, things like can't pay, won't pay, or whatever, that illustrate that would take up arms, as it were, against that thing. In fact, the parallels that we have now between the Europe of immediately before the First World War and the Europe that we face now are many dissimilarities,
but they're perhaps closer than they've been for a long time.
But when you look at Russia, when you look at the sort of macro situation, when you perhaps even look at Greece a little bit, it's difficult not to be reminded in some ways of what's going on.
There's more European and wider European antagonism than we've had for a very long time.
We just have to hope that some modern day Archduke of the German Empire doesn't wander too far down into Greece and find themselves getting assassinated by a lone gunman on a street corner.
I thought you were going to say something completely different there. I thought you were going to say somebody who has an innovative idea for a musical might come along and show us all the error of our ways, but, which I thought might be a happier answer.
Well, I'm pretty sure that somebody is working on it now, and probably there's such things already been put on, but yeah.
I'd like to draw out some of perhaps the subtler symbolism as well, which might have got lost. And I'm going to start by actually talking about the earlier production I saw in Edinburgh a good few years ago, but which was excellent. They started off as Pierrots with white painted faces. So Pierrots wear this black and white costume, as we said, sort of clowns, as you say. But they were wearing white makeup. And what was interesting was, as the thing progressed, more and more of them smeared their makeup. So by the very end, everyone except the fella playing Haig had smeared broken makeup to signify death, and in this,
well, the face had come off it, really. That's sort of what they're saying.
In this, I was very struck by the staging. It was quite a spare stage. It was a black box essentially, but there was a bit of what they'd done. They do sort of wrought iron to extend the stage layers, i.e. the stalls, the boxes and the gallery, shall we say. I think it was principally just stalls and boxes onto the stage. So it looked like the Royal Box had another box next to it, which was actually on either side of the stage. Yeah. And that was used very effectively for people to climb up and down. And obviously when you do see the Queen and the King, they are in the box briefly. And also it serves as a pulpit, actually, for Haig's almost religious devotion to his, and indeed praying to God for his plan to work. So it was quite effectively used. But what I really liked was that the set was wrought iron, and as the show progressed, and I don't know if you spotted this, the wrought iron was sort of broken. It was obviously pre-broken and made, but it looked cohesive and intact at the beginning of Act 1. As it went through Act 2, it was broken into bits, and suddenly you think, well, hang on a minute, theatre is actually a microcosm of, even to this day, a microcosm of the British class structure. You have, the higher, the lower, the cheap.
Down below, yes,
exactly. Absolutely. You've got boxes to keep the, separate the royal box. The boxes are very separate. You've got the stalls. Exactly as you say. It's a solidified representation of the British class, perhaps upside down because the cheaper people are at the top.
Yes,
but essentially you've got that. On stage, we saw that structure being broken down figuratively, because
Yes.
we saw the boxes being broken up to a degree. And I thought, well, the one thing we all know about the First World War is it broke up the social structure of the country, introduced a new one, and you could say that class is still as absolutely right, and that's true, of course it is. However, you get the rise of the middle class and the at least the eclipse for a century of the upper class.
Alan Bennett puts it in 40 Years On, the mulberry-faced gentlemen sort of come to the fore, the ones lined up behind Baldwin and Chamberlain.
Yes.
And, the sort of the professional class, as it were. It did well. I mean, the First World War is thought again in the conventional narrative to have had like a huge. It's basically spelled the beginning of the end of the empire.
Yes, it did.
Very clearly, because of course it massively financially impacted the country, apart from anything else.
Well, Britain's greatest year of production was 1913, which tells its own story.
And certainly it spelt pretty much the end of the aristocracy as it had been up to that point.
Yes, Britain is for sale, as they said in the 1920s, when all the landed estates had to, well, a lot of them had to sell up, and thank God for the National Trust.
Well, exactly, yeah. So I think it sort of did presage a de-stratification of the country. And again, there's the relevance for today's audiences. It's suddenly starting to appear again.
Which is why I use the word eclipse rather than proper diminution.
Yeah.
However, let us briefly go back to Oh, What a Lovely War. Let's just pick up a couple of things which I think are lovely. We went to see it at the Theatre Royal Stratford. They had run out of programmes for the current production, but what they were doing was selling a facsimile version of the 1963.
Yes, which is brilliant.
And the cast list is very telling. There's a few names on it who are still known today. I'm going to mention the late Victor Spinetti, who was very famous, and you may not have heard of him, but he was a close friend of the Beatles in the 1960s, when he was performing on television.
Was he not in
on stage.
Help, in fact, I think?
Absolutely. Well, he was part of their wider sort of comedy group, if you like. But the name, and George Sewell, who, amongst other things, he was in Remembrance of the Daleks, I think.
Oh, yes, that's right.
However, the name that leaps off the page most surprisingly to me is Brian Murphy, who, for a certain generation, will remember as George from George and Mildred.
That's right, yes. And, of course, he was in The Sing Detective as well. Another name that leaps off for me, actually, is Murray Melvin, who is not particularly well remembered, I think, in general, but he went on to, I can't remember if this was... I think he would have already have done this, actually, before that. I think A Taste of Honey preceded... Oh, What a Lovely War. Of course, again, I'll refer you back to the Philip Headley interview for a lot more detail about that if you want to go all the way back up to the top of the feed. But he also played the main male character in A Taste of Honey, which of course was a Stratford.
He was the taster
of
the honey.
He was a very early portrayal of a gay character, a sympathetic portrayal of a gay character on the stage, and that in itself was a bit of a
in the 60s, quite striking. Yeah.
I'm interested to know from this programme, because it is a great museum piece and it's great to have it. Just about the different style of language. Many different wines, beers, and spirits can be had from Mrs. Parham in the Long Bar or from Ed in the Circle Bar. Coffee, chocolates and snacks can be obtained from Mary in the snack bar, and you can buy in Theatre Royal Stratford East, whereas today you would buy jerk chicken, or they have a Caribbean restaurant there, enough oysters and champagne for two of 15 shillings. And it also says here, this is all their sort of indicia, in accordance with modern theatre practice, national anthems will only be played in the presence of royalty or heads of state. And I don't know if every theatre had that policy, because it was quite common in the 60s and certainly in the 50s for pretty much any entertainment to end with the
cinema
full
certainly
national anthem.
did.
Yeah.
Although, interestingly, of course, not that she's a head of state, but Princess Margaret famously came to see Oh, What a Lovely War in its original run and told the Lord Chamberlain that he ought to license it.
Oh, right, okay.
Because actually, it's the irony being that it took a personal intervention from a close member of the royal family to make sure that it was able to continue.
Right, okay.
Because we are still in the era of the Lord Chamberlain's office.
Yes, we are, just. It was still getting towards the end, wasn't it? It's like 68, I think they finished, or 67, yeah. And the other thing they have in here is a thing called the Somme Times, a reproduction of a quote advert from the Somme Times, which was basically written and printed in the front lines, it says here. So basically soldiers are sort of satirising. Are you a victim to optimism? You don't know? Then ask yourself the following questions. 1. Do you suffer from cheerfulness? 2. Do you wake up in the morning feeling like all is going well for the Allies? 3. Do you sometimes think the war will end within the next 12 months? 4. Do you believe good news in preference to bad? 5. Do you consider our leaders are competent to conduct the war to a successful issue? If your answer is yes to any one of these questions, then you are in the clutches of that dread disease. We can cure you. 2 days spent at our establishment will effectively eradicate all traces of it from your system. Do not hesitate. Apply for terms at once to Messrs. Walthorpe, Foxley, Nelms and Co. Telephone 72 Grumblestones and telegrams to Grouse. I like that a lot.
And as you say, that's an extract from something from 1916, I think, isn't it?
Yes,
from
that's right.
the war itself.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a lovely little sort of thing that was available there, and although I would have liked to have had a more contemporary programme, I must say this is a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah.
So, Tim, having seen Oh, What a Lovely War on stage for the first time, I think lovely isn't the right word for the production, but, you know, if I was asking you, how did you feel when you left, is that what you think you were intended to feel? And
yes, I think so. I mean, yes, one was generally intended to be left with the feeling that it was not a terribly good thing.
On the whole.
On the whole, it wasn't lovely at all, as the rather misleading title had led me to believe as I went into the theatre.
But there is one thing that leaps to mind that we probably need to discuss, actually, and that's being manipulated. I mean, we subscribe, I think, on the whole, as most people do, to the theory that's being promoted in this. Yeah. And you said it was a very unsubtle message, and I used the word blunt.
Yeah.
Was it manipulative?
It was persuasive. I think it's a proselytising piece of theatre, and it's intended to, as with so much of Joan Littlewood's work and Brecht before her, I think, perhaps most significantly, it was intended to reach a conclusion, and it did. The argument continues to rage among historians about how accurate or how valid that point of view is, but it's kind of hard to argue with some of the statistics about how many people died, and whether that was a good idea that they died or not is kind of trivial to argue, isn't it? And so we also do know, and I think we've known it from many wars since, that people do financially benefit from war.
Oh yes.
And that was illustrated too, wasn't it, in a little scene about arms manufacturers and how much they were making from the whole caboodle. So,
Tintin illustrates that, funnily enough. Hergé uses an example from real life in the 1930s of someone representing one of the armament companies who was selling in anticipation of the Second World War, I think, to both sides. Because there is no morality in business. No,
well, exactly. So I think it makes its point extremely forcefully, and I think very successfully. And certainly by the time that I studied the First World War, and as a child at school, and in which that was the first time I came to see the film.
Yes.
I think the narrative in Oh, What a Lovely War, as emotive and strong as it is, probably had a good deal more in shaping my opinion of it than any amount of stuff that I read in any of the textbooks I then went on to study.
Well, thank you, Tim, for talking about Oh, What a Lovely War, which we found to be a lovely experience and yet quite a striking one. And to be recommended. It is on national tour.
It's on tour. I reckon everybody should see it.
So do I, as it happens. And the one thing I would say about the excellent production I saw in Edinburgh a few years ago, it was done by a school, and I spoke to a very enlightened man who was their director, and he said he likes to do it for every school generation, so that they all get a chance to do it.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Tim. I look forward to seeing you on a future edition of Musical Talk, which they say will be all over by Christmas, but I don't believe it. Musical Talk. So these are British successes.
Yes.
Yeah. But really just didn't take off, or did, but in such a minimal way they're not remembered as such. Yes.
Basically, from my perspective, it shows that I have heard quite a bit of since I moved to this country, but I haven't heard of either rarely or not at all in the U.S. And the first thing that shot to my mind was Oh, What a Lovely War, a show that has certainly been done in the U.S., but in terms of musical theatre vernacular across the entire country, it is a show that is not talked about whatsoever.
It's quite current at the moment, isn't it, Thos?
Well, it's current here, obviously, because it's the 100th anniversary of Britain's entry into the First World War in August, the 4th of August for Britain, different dates for different countries. And so we, as a nation, are gearing up to not celebrate, but to commemorate that. And indeed, in my professional life, I'm working on that as well. Oh, What a Lovely War from the 60s, Joan Littlewood at the
Stratford.
Theatre Royal Stratford East put on this amazing show, and it's a true example of a concept show as well. It's not got a narrative. Such plot as there is there's a group of sort of Pierrots on the beach singing songs from the period, which is then slowly... very good. Which bleeds into the events of the First World War for the 4-year period, whilst these songs continue to be sung. So it contrasts the light frivolity of the songs of that period, and indeed the First World War, against the carnage and death. But there's no narrative as such. It is simple facts against music, and from which you draw you draw whatever you want to draw. Mostly that war in particular was, a disaster, a travesty, one of the world's greatest tragedies.
Is it a very pro-British musical?
No, it's a very anti-war musical. It's not pro-British, it's not pro-German, it's not pro-anyone. What it is, it's saying this war was ridiculous. And although, of course, America joined the war in 1917,
Yep.
it is certainly seen as a European conflict. Now, we don't want to draw too much from the war into the musical to say, is that why it perhaps hasn't taken off in America? But it is certainly true to say that when I think of the First World War, and I think when most people do, we think of Britain versus Germany, the Kaiser. Although it's obviously two huge power bases and blocks fighting each other on the land of France, in the Low Countries. So you've got trench warfare and the like and things like that. But it all takes place in Europe. And even when America joined, America came over to Europe and joined the trenches and the fighting there. So everything is a very, very European war. Whereas the theatres of war in the Second World War were worldwide. They're all over the place. They are principally, not exclusively, but principally European. Oh, What a Lovely War ties very much in its way of depicting that war. Therefore, must in nature be European at its widest and British at its most narrow. But it was a startling piece of British theatre at its time, and is rightly remembered in this country. And I've seen it in the Edinburgh Fringe. It's every couple of years or so it comes up in some version. And I remember speaking to an incredibly enlightened drama teacher who had brought up a brilliant production 2 or 3 years ago, saying that he does it once every generation of school children in the school he works for to make sure that every child in that school has an opportunity to see it. So, if they stay there for 5 or 7 years, every 5 or 7 years he'll do another production of it and take it to Edinburgh. So it is genuinely, it's a household name in this country. Not everyone will have seen it because it's not revived professionally that often. It's a fairly big ask because it's not a jolly piece, as you can imagine, and it's fairly satirical.
Misleading.
Well, that's the name of the song. That is a song from the First World War, but the song itself is a sarcastic song. It's got lines in it about how we're going to spend our soldiers' pay, which is fantastic, and how we love the army rations. If you listen to the lyrics of the song, although it's a very upbeat march, it's a very
ironic.
It's an ironic, satirical song, and that. Yes, it's a British Tommy's song, if you like. It's a song sung by the British Army in the First World War. But you're right, the title, if you don't know the song, suggests you might be getting a romp, but you're getting a romp with death. If that makes sense.
And also a huge success now at Theatre Royal Stratford East.
Well, and obviously this is the year to revive it, and it is being revived in its original theatre, and is getting star upon star upon star. I mean, it's doing really well, and I rather hope there's going to be a transfer. So it's worth catching if you ever get the chance. But if you can't see this production, see other productions, because it's undoubtedly going to be put on all over Britain, I would have said, in amateur versions.
Sometimes 80th all over again.
Yes, if you like, okay. The Kaiser's 100th. But the point is, it is done everywhere here. It's done at amateur level. It is not necessarily always on professionally, but it's a household name, and there was a film of it. So I'm really, featuring some really big British names. And I think, I could be absolutely wrong, I think the film is directed by Richard Attenborough, who's famous for Gandhi and things, he's one of our great British directors. So that shows, in British terms, that it must have made money.
Am I correct in saying that there are some American songs in the piece as well? Do you know offhand?
Well,
I know it opens with a song called Row, Row, Row. Is that a British or an American piece?
There are 2 songs with that title.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's Row, Row, Row Your Boat Gently Down the Stream,
Well,
which is a
course,
British folk song.
Yes.
And then there's She Went and Row, Row, Row Way Down the River and She Row, Row, Row.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, I can't now tell you which of the 2, because they're now rolling round my head. Rowing round my head, absolutely. Yes, I'm paddling for land. I'm getting it wrong. That's because Britain's flooded at the time we record this. I can't tell you which of the 2 it is. But certainly, the First World War, in terms of the musical, where most of his numbers are musical numbers, was incredibly influenced. In fact, the First World War is identified in British terms as being the high watermark of the musical. We always think of it as Victorian, but actually its greatest influence and success was in the First World War, because we didn't have radio, we didn't have television, we didn't have talking film. So actually the main form of entertainment was going to the musical, and the musical could be satirical, could be funny. It was exactly the kind of escapist entertainment that people want in a war. But also all the American folk songs were stuff, the George M. Cohan's, David. I look at you and I say this, I always think of you.
Thank you.
But those songs are coming over, the early Tin Pan Alley stuff, the early Irving Berlin. Won't You Come Home, Bill Bailey, in this country is seen as a British musical song. even though it's clearly an American song.
Oh, yes, very much indeed.
But, so we were assimilating lots of American songs at that time, exactly as we did in the Second World War, and indeed in between the wars. But that, if you like, is the first real wave of American songs being adopted by the British as day-to-day songs in this country. So
right.
I would be absolutely astounded if there weren't American songs included in Oh, What a Lovely War.
And just by that same token, the songs written in America at the time, like you said, with the Tin Pan Alley numbers and things like that, were an amalgamation of different cultures to begin with anyway. Those weren't distinctly American either, necessarily.
Well, I may be wrong on this, but I've always assumed that Won't You Come Home, Bill Bailey was, forgive me, a black number. I could be completely wrong on this. I'm quite happy for people to write to me and tell me I am wrong. But I understood that she is a black woman lamenting driving her husband from the home.
It could very well be, yeah.
I still want to explore more with David, that you heard about it only when you came to Britain, and in what context? Just in general conversation? Or
just in general pop cultural references, absolutely. That's the thing. In the U.S., that's not to say that nobody in the U.S. has heard of Oh, What a Lovely War. It's just that it doesn't come up in day-to-day conversation if you're in the musical theater community, whereas it comes up very often here. And I find it fascinating that this is a piece that came out of the 1960s, you were saying,
yes,
as did the piece Cabaret, which does have very obvious European links,
yes,
and is also a satirization of war to a great extent.
Certainly the build-up to, in that case, yes.
It'd be interesting to see when those two would have come out in the U.S. and what the correlation would have been between the two.
And yet the difference is that, if you like, Oh, What a Lovely War is an early example of a jukebox musical.
Okay.
It hasn't got a through line in terms of composer and lyricist, because it's a hodgepodge, exactly as the musical was. Whereas, of course, I was going to say I Am a Camera. I'm getting
Cabaret.
Cabaret. Thank you very much.
Same.
Cabaret is by Candron Ebb, and therefore has a through line of feel and tone,
right.
even though it's writing pastiche numbers of that period, the Weimar Republic in the 30s. You're right. I hadn't stopped to think of the parallels, because I think Oh, What a Lovely War is... I think it's a mid-60s thing in terms of theatre, and I think it's a late 60s thing in terms of film. I don't know why. I think 68 or 69 in terms of the film.
Well,
and of course,
72, I believe, because it was the same era as Godfather, Lost Out to Godfather.
And that's Cabaret.
72, I believe. Yeah.
Yes,
Cabaret,
so they're overlapping, certainly.
Okay.
But is there an equivalent of Oh, What a Lovely War in what is the World War I musical in America? Do you have an answer to that question?
In terms of World War I musicals, there are not many that have survived. There are songs that have certainly survived, Over There being one of the perfect examples. Over There is still a song used very much in the U.S. and, of course, recently used here in the U.K. for the Go Compare commercials, which is brilliant. But other than the songs, there are not any shows that have survived the test of time in the U.S.
Even shows that were afterwards, because this one's not an original World War I song.
That's true.
If you're talking about shows from the period, the one that's most known is Chu Chin Chow.
Right.
Which isn't hugely known, although it was revived in London a few years ago in a pub theatre on a professional basis. That's really an operetta from about 1915-16, and it isn't really about the war at all. It just happens to be during the war when it was, and became a lovely bit of escapist nonsense. It's sort of the, I believe it's the Aladdin story, essentially. It's set in China, as you can imagine, with a title like that.
Do you think America's response to the World War was doing frivolous musicals and the kind of musical comedy things, and they were trying to escape from the doldrums?
Well, I don't think just America. I think everyone's response. I mean, the 20s, was the period of flappers and the roar.
A lot of silly nonsense.
It roared, even roared in Germany, didn't it? I mean, the Weimar Republic stuff is satirical, but it's done with, it's satire through fun. America is writing all its, in some senses, that's the first great age of the American musical. With the 20s, you've got the Gershwins and the Berlins at least working. You've got, in the late 20s, you've got the Rodgers and Hart starting to turn up on the scene. Cole Porter is starting to arrive. So, you've got those great
all
people.
Of European descent, of course.
Except Cole Porter. Yeah. Cole Porter is American born and bred, of course, but he's utterly different from the rest of them. But you're right. I don't think you could argue that Irving Berlin was European, because he was Russian. But I know what you mean. The land block of Eurasia, if you like.
Exactly.
Yeah, if we're getting very technical. Yes. So you've got that. That is the 20s response, absolutely, to the deprivations of the war, and to a lesser degree, we had exactly the same thing in this country. We had lots of reviews and things like that. And we were using American shows, all the American shows. Fred Astaire and Adele Astaire, his sister, who were the big dancing, singing American,
famous partner.
dance and musical theatre partners, came over to Britain and were hugely feted and became friends with the then Prince of Wales, who went on to become Edward VIII. They were feted by society, which wouldn't happen before the First World War. So, yes, you're right. The world does become much more frivolous, at least culturally, after the First World War. But I'm really interested that there is no retrospective World War I musical of any kind, narrative or without, in the American idiom.
Nothing that was famous, certainly whatsoever. In the 60s, the closest thing that you had, anything that was a comment on anything politically or socially, the three biggest things you had coming out of the 60s were certainly cabaret, which we've already mentioned. You had Hair that came
of course
slightly later, slightly before cabaret was Fiddler on the Roof, which certainly had a lot of things to say politically and socially for the time.
Yeah, not least about pogroms, of course, which takes you back, the persecution of a race, absolutely straight back to the Second World War.
Exactly.
Musical Talk. Oh, Tim, thank you for joining me again. And today is going to be a little bit new, a little bit old.
Yes.
But nothing borrowed and nothing blue, I think.
Well, blue maybe, I don't know.
We're talking again about Oh, What a Lovely War. Now, we saw it last week,
Yes.
but we were making great reference to the recent production and some reference to the 1963 version for which we had the programme. Later in this episode, people will be able to hear the interview that you conducted with Philip Headley. Well, I'll ask you to introduce that in a minute, if that's okay. But I've got another question for you about Oh, What a Lovely War and its importance. We were talking about it specifically as a crusading piece of theatre last week. It's something that is, and you used the word, legendary in British theatrical circles. But it did go over to Broadway, and it did not do well. It really didn't last very long at all on Broadway. And I was talking about this with David Herzog, who is one of our colleagues here on Musical Talk, who is an American citizen, lives over here. And he was saying, Oh, What a Lovely War is one of those shows that since he's been a performer and actor in Britain, he hears about all the time. People talk about it all the time. It's just one of those shows that is sort of lodged in our memory, whether people have seen it or not. It's spoken about. He said, as an American, it was not something of which he was ever aware, even though it was performed briefly on Broadway. Why is that, do you think? Do you have an answer as to why?
Because it illustrates the British or the experience of those in the British Isles.
It's as simple as that, is it? You don't think...
Well, yeah, I do, actually. I think it... I don't
and our
think
war was
I
4.5 years.
I don't think the First World War has anything like the same status in the sort of, the historical hinterland, if you like, of the... if you compare that to, say, how sort of deeply rooted the Civil War is in the American consciousness and its reverberations are felt yet today, I don't think the same is quite as true, other than in sort of more abstract styles of, international politics that exist. I suppose in the Middle East it kind of is true. The impact, and of course the home front wasn't, I don't think, quite as badly affected. In the First War, famously they only got involved in 1917, and
yes.
and for reasons which weren't necessarily the ones presented at the time. And so in that sense, I don't think it does have really the same significance in the American narrative as the Civil War, Vietnam being the two sort of huge ones, and obviously the Second World War as well. It's just. It looked, I think, to them perhaps a little bit like it was a European war and not being fought on some general principle the way that the war against Hitler was fought.
Yes, so it was a war of... it was a war between squabbling empires. I don't think
yes,
it's
exactly.
very difficult to argue against that, really.
I think from their perspective they might have thought, well, they'll let them bash it out between themselves and let's see what's left at the end. But and of course it didn't turn out that way. But yeah.
And this is a question I can't answer, and I'm not expecting you to answer, but of course actually at the time, and we said last week that in 1963 so much of its strength and potency came from the fact it was subverting songs which were well known from the British music hall tradition.
Yes. And there are a parallel set of songs in the American music hall of the time, or the vaudeville of the time, which also have significance, but they're not the same songs, are they?
No, they're not, and that's the point. I wonder how British, one assumes a song like When Belgium Put the Kibosh on the Kaiser would not have had a great deal of currency.
That's right.
In America.
If you were trying to get to that
era,
era, you'd be looking at George M. Cohan and whatever else immediately after him. I suppose you wouldn't really be sort of reaching to the same. And of course, if you think the Depression also is as a sort of a kind of an outcome of the war, if you like, but
yes,
but certainly as
it's a sequel at least.
Yes, exactly. Again, also has, if you look at some of the great sort of, just in terms of musical theatre, like what are the great resonant musicals there? I'm pretty sure Miss Saigon ran fairly successfully on Broadway. I might have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it did. And of course, that was focused around Vietnam. Annie, I was just sort of, I think, trying to steer towards there by mentioning
your depression,
the depression of the New Deal and all of that sort of time. And of course, I don't know actually. Of course, 1776. I suppose there's not really a. Can we think of a First World War American musical? Or indeed great famous film, you know. I mean,
No.
not that's the equivalent of From Here to Eternity or you know, for the Civil War, Gone with the Wind.
All Quiet on the Western Front is the most famous of the First World War films, I
Yes,
think.
but of course, All Quiet on the Western Front is a German story.
Yes.
It's not. It was indeed American produced. Now, I recently watched it, but it's told as, you know, the tale of somewhere else. I think not the tale of. It's not. You know, it's literally told from the point of view of what for the Americans too was the other side.
Actually, I can find a link between the Depression and the First World War in song, because there's a song called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?
Oh, yeah.
And the man is a former sort of tycoon, once I built a railroad, and he represents the American everyman who was building a brave new world. And he makes reference to, there's a line, unfortunately, in all the versions I've heard, which are sung by American singers, you know, Bing Crosby, excellent singer, but what we would call khaki, unfortunately, the Americans will call khaki, which unfortunately in British slang means soiled with human excrement. But there's a line to the effect of once in khaki trousers.
Yes.
And then there's basically a whole section about how he was fighting for his nation, and you know they were heroes for America, and now here they are begging on the streets.
Yes.
And that is a direct link between one and the other.
True,
but it's a song and not a musical.
Yeah.
And my second and last question about legacy then of the war, and indeed its other sequel, which is World War II, in fact so named to make it helpful for us. People who want things in chronological order, we've done it that way for you.
We're still waiting, as with Toy Story, well, not as with Toy Story anymore, for the all-important third thing to complete the sequence.
I'm very much not hoping for World War III, but thank you for asking. Here's my question. We, at least in Britain, have the musical from the First World War, and you said, quite rightly, I think, that there's nothing quite like it elsewhere that we're aware of, that we can immediately bring to mind, at least. Why is there no truly successful Second World War musical? Particularly when the Second World War is, in a way, easier to define in narrative terms, because there's a very clear villain, if you like. You know, if you're looking for a war that has a righteous...
The producers, I suppose, yeah. Which, of course, you can't.
Yes. I'm ruling out, by the way, musicals from the Second World War, such as a George Formby film where he bashes Hitler on the nose,
right?
Or
the Great, it's not a musical, but the Great,
or Stage Door Canteen, which were actually all about being in the middle of the war and raising morale. I'm actually talking about shows that took the war as a narrative, and set themselves in the war.
So we know that there was a From Here to Eternity fairly recently, which was by Tim Rice and his collaborators,
which leads up to Pearl Harbor, which brings America in 41. No.
There's also things like Marguerite, which again was a very recent, Bubel and Schoenberg, or I can't remember.
Yes, it was.
It was Legrand, Michel Legrand, and one of Bubel and Schoenberg.
Sort of 3 or 4 years ago, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right, and didn't really take off. I've just had a quick look on the category World War II musicals on Wikipedia, and to my astonishment, because you know there are any number of World War II films, British, German, you know,
American,
and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Hollywood still making them.
And you can count things like Schindler's List as well, because of course they're sort of clearly relevant. You can also point to things like Cabaret and things which and The Sound of Music, which are sort of the run-up to the war, but not necessarily depicting the war
Nazi terror, you might call it.
Yeah, exactly. But the Wikipedia category for World War II musicals contains the following: only Blitz, Lionel Bart, which again is not really lasted that well. Carmen Jones, which of course was
It's an Oscar Hammerstein reworking of Carmen.
That's right. Beat Out That Rhythm on a Drum and all that. From Here to Eternity, which we just mentioned. I think called Yalta Yalta, which I don't know much about, but I wonder if it's anything to do with the
Yalta Conference?
Yes, possibly, although it's spelled with a J.
Is there one called Potsdam? It's back.
And finally, South Pacific.
Of course.
Of which there is nothing like. And that's it, really. And of course, South Pacific is sort of depicts a little bit of a backwater of the war. I mean, that's kind of a little bit of a tribute.
But you're right. But what these are, they're different. I mean, this is the thing about the Second World War, is actually the First World War has it had lots of branches, but really we all know the main theatre of war was the trenches.
Yes.
I mean, there's plenty going on. I don't want to undersell it, but that's how you think of it.
Yes, that's
the
right.
Second World War was actually, in some senses, much more global, and there were lots of different kinds of wars going on in lots of different kinds of places.
In some ways, perhaps it still seems. Again, this is kind of a weird thing to say in relation to the First World War, but it still seems too serious to sort of depict in that way. At least the actual action of the battlefields, the actual things that happened there. But it's kind of odd to think, isn't it, that there hasn't been a successful attempt. I'm sure there have been attempts to do a musical. There was one a few years ago, wasn't there? Only the Brave, I think, which was Keith
Jack appeared in it in Edinburgh.
That's right. But again, it hasn't.
And if I may put my hand on my heart, it was awful. It was actually, but what it did do, in fairness, was actually split the audience. But that didn't know what it was doing. There was in the sense that there was a bit of home front.
Yeah.
Because certainly in Britain, the Second World War is as much about the home front as it is about the front line.
Well, one of the definitive films we were just saying before we started recording this was Hope and Glory, which is a home front film. It dates from 1987. It's a John Borman film. John Borman.
Oh, John Borman.
And it's a sort of nostalgic sketch of his childhood in the during the period of the Blitz, and then sort of a bit later on through the war, and even that, which could indeed be a good deal cosier, and it's a fairly cosy film. As far as I know, nobody's successfully managed to adapt that or anything, or to do something similar. So it's a real mystery.
I've seen a few attempts in Edinburgh as well at various Second World War musicals, but they do exactly that thing we were talking about in the first episode about Oh What a Lovely War that somebody has suggested to us, which is they had made it all about couples or families, normally couples. One stays at home, the woman for the home front, one goes to war, the man for the fighting. Yeah. And the question is going to be, how does she cope and will he live?
Right, yeah.
And there's, there are certain things which in all of these, there's the telephone or telegram message back, that someone maybe not necessarily the hero, but someone close to the hero has been killed to bring home the point that everyone's in jeopardy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the, what's the loneliness of separation? At home, and also whether other people are going to muscle in on your girl, funny enough, in a slightly more trivial way, although not to be discounted. But the problem is they don't make a big mix. You can't. That doesn't, forgive me, that's soap opera, and not very important.
Well, I mean, again, I think a lot of the other thing is that with Oh What a Lovely War, which is the sort of definitive First World War musical, in a sense, that was a piece of work that perhaps needed to be done. To illustrate the massive impact of the war and to sort of really throw into relief like how successful it had been in whatever its objective was, and indeed to throw into relief that its objective wasn't entirely clear, and for the amount of lives that were thrown away for it. Whereas of course the Second World War,
the First World War,
the Second World War doesn't require that.
Yeah. Was it worth it? First World War? Probably not. Was it worth it? Second World War? Probably yes.
Yeah, and so I think in that sense, the sort of moral, the morality of the Second World War has always been a little bit harder to unpick in a way. I'm sure there's, and I suppose the great evil of the Second World War, which is the Holocaust, is difficult to depict in a musical, I think, and it has not that it hasn't been attempted, but it's pretty darn hard to find the right way to do that, and the matter of taste really does start to become all encompassing, I think, when you're talking about musical entertainment, and even ironically it's quite hard to pull off in a way that people wouldn't find offensive. Yeah, exactly.
So in a way we're almost saying that the First World War, because of its nature, and almost, you can't say it's homogenous, but it seems to feel a little more homogenous than the Second World War and all the consequences and legacy of it. The First World War, it is containable enough to be able to talk about the war itself, whereas the Second World War is a bit too sprawling and enormous, and therefore all you can ever do is paint onto the canvas of the Second World War a story, rather than address the story of the Second World War.
Like Casablanca or whatever, I mean that's that sort of thing. But it's just hard to it's hard to know why there hasn't been a winning musical formula yet, but
and I think we should draw the world's attention. The world's attention, I tell you,
we should.
To one of the great British war films is In Which We Serve by Noel Coward, and Noel Coward was famous for writing songs and writing musicals, but he chose not to write that as a musical. That's a very serious piece.
Yes, it's kind of hard to imagine it really, but yeah.
Yes, I accept your point, but it could be done.
There have been adaptations of things like Goodnight Mr. Tom and things to do with evacuees and stuff like that. But again, not
home front stuff.
Well,
Bed Knobs and Broomsticks, for goodness sake, is a wartime musical.
That's true, actually. Yes, they should put that on their list on Wikipedia. I mean, maybe that's the most successful example. I mean, admittedly, a good deal of it consists of a visit to an entirely different kingdom and an entirely different kind of war in the form of a football match. But
although that's a First World War story, I've just realised, isn't it? The football match across the trenches.
Oh yes, that's true.
I wonder if I don't think that's a deliberate plundering, but
I'm not sure we can
draw too much from that.
Yeah, we can know. Yeah.
There we are. Well, it's a question I love asking because I don't think there's a very easy answer, and I look forward to the day when someone comes up with a Second World War musical which is genuinely worthwhile and has some kind of resonance which is more than just soap opera-ish. But I do like Blitz, by the way, but actually, in my view, the Blitz has very little to do with Blitz. It is a background for a love story and two feuding families. So, Tim, you had the privilege of interviewing Philip Headley a few years ago. Tell us who Philip Headley is, because not everyone will know.
Philip Headley is the former artistic director of the Theatre Royal Stratford East, which he took over from Joan Littlewood back in the day. He retired in about, I think, 2004, 2005. So the point at which I met him, he'd been sort of... he was still very active. I think during the interview he did take a couple of phone calls related to various contacts and making connections with the current management of Stratford East, which still is, at this stage, Kerry Michael. But no, I think it was just very interesting to go back and to just hear again from his perspective. One of my big interests to talk to him about was the origination at Stratford East of the urban musical, something that they've arguably not continued with actually since his time necessarily, or at least not in quite the same way.
There's been a much lower profile for that kind of thing in the last 5 years,
yes.
I think, yes.
But of course also it was a great chance to talk about the 60s and to talk about Joan Littlewood, and in particular Oh What a Lovely War and A Taste of Honey. So thank you for giving me a chance to dig this one out of the archives, and I remember I spent a lot of time editing it, and I think it's great, if you haven't caught it before, for us to give you a chance to hear from the great Philip Headley.
Well, it was an extraordinary beginning of the story. It was a bit like a tiny episode from that wonderful Bette Davis film, All About Eve, in that 1960, I first went to that theatre, and I'd just come back from Australia, where I was in my teenage years, and I happened to wander in there, and I saw a production of Every Man in His Humour by Ben Jonson. And in my university arrogance, I knew that Ben Jonson was boring. I'd read a play by him, so I knew he was boring. And when I got there, I was listening to a couple of the women, local East End women, in the coffee bar who were setting out the cups and so on. I'd arrived an hour early because I had no idea where Theatre Royal Stratford East was. And consequently, I was listening to the Cockney accent and them telling stories and being very funny. And I hadn't heard the genuine Cockney accent before, because in British films it was Cockney as via RADA, really, middle-class people learning Cockney.
Riding it down as far as it'll go and then blowing your nose type of thing.
That's right. And here it was, and I was very entertained, and pretending to read a book and just listening to them. And I left it right till the show started and all the bells had gone. And then I went into the show, and the lights... So as soon as I got in, the show started, and I couldn't believe it. It changed my life, because I'm very glad I did that process. I mean, having been away so long, listening to those two women, and then the Ben Jonson started, and it was exactly the same as the two women out in the bar. It was the same rhythms and so on, because it was one of his Cockney plays, you know. I just couldn't believe how accessible it was and understandable and brilliantly funny, and so much happening at the same time on the stage. When it finished, I, like an idiot, I sort of wandered into the foyer and went to this man that looked like he was in charge of something and said, "What is there?" What? I was inarticulate. And he said, "Oh, they have a class on Saturday mornings, which you may want to go to, which the actors from Joan Littlewood's company do." And so I went there. But, I mean, the All About Eve bit is sort of... That's how I wandered in and said, anything I can do. And, of course, 20 years later, I was running the place. I took over. And Joan, of course, it was a working-class communist from before the war, and a company, very much a company, which lived and ate and everything together, and very poor for years, touring around England and creating a revolution in terms of bringing the working class centre stage, using music a great deal in her work, Ewan MacColl being the principal composer. He wrote Dirty Old Town, for example, for a Joan Littlewood production. And she managed to get a truthfulness and a theatrical truth, really. It wasn't realistic truth. It was based on realistic truth. So if you were, as in The Queer Fella, which was set in a prison, and you know she would have the actors up on the roof of the theatre, actually, walking around for 3 hours as though they were in a prison and trying to communicate with each other so the guards wouldn't see that. That she would do that kind of improvising before almost anybody else was using it, certainly in British theatre. And a great deal that is now common practice in theatre, which many students will learn, of like the vast amounts of research she used to do, all sorts of methods in rehearsal, singing it, dancing it, swapping parts around, working in a very free way, often creating total chaos at times.
How did this sort of thing play out in terms of in terms of musical theatre?
I thought she paid less attention to what was actually happening on stage once a song started. Sometimes it was most peculiar. She could work for hours on 3 lines, and then the music took over, and she didn't. I don't know. She let it work for itself in some extraordinary way. It really did surprise me, that. But, I mean, in Lovely War, of course, she used it in sort of deeply ironically, those very populist, very jolly songs with great tunes and so wonderful songs in their own way from the First World War. But she used it, the music in that was pretty ironic. It was very interesting, actually, those who didn't see the original production of Oh, What a Lovely War, but the production that was at the National, I don't know, up to 10 years ago, wasn't it? The difference was, and I think where it's often wrongly produced these days, the major difference, and it was certainly the case at the National, was that the whole show was from the point of view of the working class men in the trenches, and it was recognising them that the show was largely about. And so you'd get songs which would have just 2 or 3 voices, or it had 2 or 3 very good singers for some songs that needed it, but most of them were very workmanlike actors' voices when it came to singing. So I can remember that scene where all the Pierrots, what they're dressed as and what they're playing, were all shot and ended up on the stage, dead on the stage, and then one head comes up, and this sort of ghost-like, presumably they're dead now, and music brings them alive, and one starts to sing "The bells of hell go ting-a-ling-a-ling for you but not for me," one voice very quietly, and very gradually other voices join, and you finally get a chorus of it and it gets them off stage as well, because they were dead. But at the National, this was symbolic of the difference, that they're all dead, and suddenly 6 heads all come up, all start singing at the same moment with brilliant harmonies and so on and so forth, which was not part of the point of the show. That wasn't ordinary men in trenches. That was showbiz. That was a director trying to prove that she could direct a musical, really. But it's not a musical of that kind, and its heart is not in all that. And it was very interesting too. It was a very good example in musical theatre of choreographing and expressing every damn word of what you're singing. And finally, it's confusing. Make a man of you, I'll make a man of you. When Avis Budge sang that in the original, she was still as still could be, with the eyes slowly travelling around the auditorium and a sort of inner beat going on. You couldn't see, but you could feel. And then, of course, at the National, it's choreographed all over the place and far less effective. Far less.
Philip Headley there talking in 2007. And if you want to hear more of that interview, you can go back a long way into the past to episode 26 of Musical Talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Tim. And I look forward to speaking to you again in the future, because I've already spoken to you in the past. That door is closed to me now.
Yes, exactly.
Musical Talk. Well, there we are. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. We're not quite finished yet, but we will be hearing again from Philip Headley, but this time in written form. But first, if you want to hear some of those previous episodes, you can do so. The conversation between Nick Hudson, David Herzog and myself about the comparative failure of Oh What a Lovely War in America, and its absolute failure to have a legacy there, unlike in Britain, where it is still renowned for being a piece of society-changing theatre, can be found in episode 382 from the Musical Talk archive, and the episode is called Transatlantic Turmoils. And if you'd like to hear the complete conversation that Tim Sayward had with Philip Headley, you can do so by going back to episode 26 from 2007, which was a discussion for the most part between Tim and Philip about the urban musical and the role of the Theatre Royal Stratford East in helping to develop that particular genre. But, as I said, that's not the last of Philip Headley in this episode. I'm going to briefly pick up on something we discussed when I said that Oh What a Lovely War is still controversial, at least in some sense. I touched on the fact that in early 2014, the then Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove MP, criticised what he saw as a left-wing reading of the First World War. And such was the importance of his article, it was in the Daily Mail, that actually it generated a national debate in the newspapers about whether or not fighting the First World War had been a worthwhile thing or not. And so to finish off today, I'm going to read a little of what Michael Gove said, and then a little of the riposte from Philip Headley, which was published in the newspapers. So, to begin, here's just a small extract, but a relevant one, from Michael Gove's article in the Daily Mail of 2nd of January 2014. The title of the article was "Why Does the Left Insist on Belittling True British Heroes?" And here's the section that relates to Oh What a Lovely War. Michael Gove says, "The war was, of course, an unspeakable tragedy, which robbed this nation of our bravest and best. But even as we recall that loss and commemorate the bravery of those who fought, it's important that we don't succumb to some of the myths which have grown up about the conflict. Our understanding of the war has been overlaid by misunderstandings and misrepresentations which reflect an, at best, ambiguous attitude to this country, and at worst, an unhappy compulsion on the part of some to denigrate virtues such as patriotism, honour and courage. The conflict has, for many, been seen through the fictional prism of dramas such as Oh What a Lovely War, The Monocled Mutineer and Blackadder as a misbegotten shambles, a series of catastrophic mistakes perpetuated by an out-of-touch elite. Even to this day, there are left-wing academics all too happy to feed those myths." Now, I'm not going to read the rest of the article, and that is just a small extract from it, but there I think you have the essential point that Mr. Gove was putting across. And as you can see, he actually quoted a piece of musical theatre in part of his argument. Oh, what a lovely war. Such is the standing of that piece, which was already 51 years old when he wrote that article. And as you can imagine, it was a fairly controversial view on his part, because the world has moved on and does generally see the First World War as a war that was nothing but a tragedy with very little that came out of it which was positive. Well, it's my view that Musical Talk is not the place where this debate should be had. I'm merely reading out these quotations to give you an idea of the fact that Oh What a Lovely War still has a legacy today. And legacy it does have, because in the surrounding newspaper furore, which took place after Mr. Gove's article was published, Philip Headley, who, as we say, is the co-executor of Joan Littlewood's estate, wrote a letter to the Guardian newspaper, which was published on the 7th of January 2014. And I'm going to read that letter in full, not least because it continues to show that Oh What a Lovely War has something to say about British history and current British politics, but also because it gives us more insight into the creation of Oh What a Lovely War in 1963. So, here's what Philip Headley wrote. Michael Gove holds up the show Oh What a Lovely War as an example of a left-wing attempt to peddle unpatriotic myths, and the Education Department's defence of its boss implies that this universally acclaimed show denigrates the patriotism, humour and courage demonstrated by ordinary British soldiers in the First World War. This is a calumny of the work of Joan Littlewood, Jerry Raffles and all those artists in Theatre Workshop who created the show at Theatre Royal Stratford East. The opposite is the truth. A vital part of a show's success lay in the fact that it told the story of the First World War from the point of view of the men in the trenches. Not long ago, the respected playwright Peter Nichols said of the original production in 1963, "Joan Littlewood's masterpiece remains for me the most compelling theatre experience of my life. The supreme tragic event of our century was told with a gaiety that, by using their own songs, showed what spirit had been crushed out of the glorious dead by 4 years of Vickers guns, poison gas and shells." As for it being part of a left-wing conspiracy, important source material came from the Tory MP Alan Clark's book The Donkeys, the title of which came from the phrase describing the soldiers as lions led by donkeys. Princess Margaret attended the original production accompanied by Lord Cobbold, who in his capacity as Lord Chamberlain was in charge of theatrical censorship. Whilst congratulating the cast, Princess Margaret said to the director, "What you said here tonight, Miss Littlewood, should have been said a long time ago," and then added, "Don't you agree, Lord Cobbold?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, and Joan Littlewood made the aside to a nearby cast member, "That's our permission," meaning permission to go ahead with a transfer to the West End, which Lord Cobbold's department was apparently having doubts about, without considerable changes. It seems Mr. Gove now wishes to appoint himself the censor of theatre at the heart of the education system. Philip Headley, co-executor of Joan Littlewood's estate. Now, as I say, it is not the place for Musical Talk to get involved in the political and national discussion on the importance or otherwise of the First World War, and whether or not the cultural inheritance that we've received about it over the last century is negative, positive or neutral. However, there is almost no better example of musical theatre being and continuing to be A, controversial, and B, culturally important in terms of national thinking than Oh, What a Lovely War. And I hope in this episode we've shown that. It is amazing to me that here, 15 years into the 21st century, we're still talking about a show which is now 52 years old and which is still making the newspapers. It is such an important show. If you get a chance to see it, please do. That's it for the time being here on Musical Talk. I do hope you've enjoyed this little canter through the political and cultural legacy of Oh, What a Lovely War. We'll be back next week with another episode, this time about something very different. So do be sure to tune in then. And until that time, I have nothing further to say to you except goodbye. So here's me doing it. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk was presented by Tim Saywood, Nick Hudson, David Herzog and Thos Ribbits, and was edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2018. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos.